Hi, so I edited the paper for Ayanna Morgan. Her paper is titled Gender Policies in the European Union. I thought this was a really good paper altogether. It was an enjoyable topic to read about. I think it's a good choice and topic because of everything that's going on here in the US with the feminism movement and gender equality here and all of that, so it was very relatable. So starting off with your introduction, I thought it was really strong. You have a very established thesis, which is good. What I'm getting from it is that gender equality has been a discussion with some positive steps and some not so positive steps that have taken a step back. Sometimes those steps fall short, so I think you can tighten your thesis up a bit, but the ideas are all there, so I'm understanding what you're going for when you are talking about all the steps that they've taken towards gender equality in the EU. So the next part of your paper is section 1, and that section is called the Treaty of Rome. So I thought this was really interesting. You had a lot of insight to the Treaty of Rome and what it did to take steps towards gender equality. I learned a lot in this section, actually, so thank you for that. It was interesting because they passed this Treaty of Rome around the same time that the equal pay law was passed in the U.S. A few years earlier from what I got from your paper. So yeah, there was just a couple minor spelling errors in this section that you can fix, but those are minor, like I said. At the end of your paragraph, or at the end of the section, you mention that the efforts of the European Commission have opened new but unequal employment opportunities for women. I think this is a great time to discuss what those are. Give us like some concrete examples of what these new but unequal employment opportunities are. Just like an example or two so that your reader has something to actually like think about, like a concrete thing in their head. All in all, that was a good section though, and I really enjoyed it. Your second section is also another treaty, and it is called the Treaty of Amsterdam. Your insight gave me some new and interesting information to think about, as opposed to your first section. They were related to each other, but also contrasted each other, which I thought was really good, and it was a great lead into the second section from your first. The treaty of, you do a nice job at the end explaining how Article 141 is very much like Article 119, but also how it expanded on Article 119. So, like I said, from Section 1 to Section 2, you did a really good job of playing off of each other and leading into the second section. You quote Article 2 of the Treaty of Amsterdam, but you should go into a further explanation of the importance of this quote. So you have a full quote as it's a standalone paragraph, and you just need to emphasize a little bit what it really means and why it's important. Like, why is that the quote you chose? Explain it a little further. So try to simplify that a little for your reader, and otherwise that's also really good. So your third section is the Equal Pay Directive of 1975. So this section starts off really strong with some good insight into Article 141, which had been mentioned earlier. So you just further explained it, which I thought was great. So I would suggest going further into detail with why France had already implemented this legislation and why other member states were not so quick to implement it. So explain to us, your reader, why it took so long for other member states to implement something that was positive for women. Why was it taking them so long? And why was France the first? Why did they already have this initiative implemented into their society? The first paragraph was a great lead into the second when it starts to talk about the Equal Pay Directive, and I really enjoyed this paragraph. I felt like I learned a lot about the gender pay gap in the EU, which I didn't know a lot about before, and you did a great job of explaining it. And the tidbit of information from Eurostat at the end of the paragraph was a really good closing, and I thought it tied it all together really well. Your fourth section is the Equal Treatment Directive of 1976. I found it interesting that the Equal Treatment Directive allowed for discrimination in 3 instances. I thought that was a really good chunk of information to add, because it kind of contrasts the name of the Equal Treatment Directive. But the further you read, it explains what those discrimination instances are and how they aren't discrimination towards women or really like a minority. It's more just discriminate. It's kind of more towards men. But I thought that was a really good information to add because it seems like that equal treatment directive would be equal treatment for everyone, but it did have little hints of discrimination. So I thought that was interesting information to add for your reader to really wrap their head around what it was and what it was doing for women. I would like to know further how Article 141 overcovered equal pay aspects. You mentioned that it did overpay, or it overcovered equal pay aspects, but that just seemed a little confusing for your reader. How does it do that, or how did it do that? Explain a little further how and why it overcovered equal pay aspects, because that was a little confusing. In the court case you mentioned is a super strong example of what you're trying to prove. So there was a couple of spelling errors there, and the wording was a little funky, but those are like easily fixable. I think the court case is an amazing example, and you should definitely keep that in there and maybe even play off of it a little bit further. It was really interesting. That's one of my favorite parts of your paper. The 5th section you talk about is gender mainstreaming. So I would first of all take the last sentence in your first paragraph and make it your first, because you go through the whole paragraph and explain, you don't really explain what gender mainstreaming is until that last paragraph. So I would do that first because not everyone knows what this is. I didn't at first. So explain what it is first, and maybe even provide a little bit more of an explanation, because it still took me a little bit further into the section to understand it. But if you explain it first and then the rest of your paragraph will follow, it'll be really great. The paragraphs on the 3-legged stools of equality were probably your strongest paragraphs in your paper. From what I read so far, I really enjoyed reading those. You do a great explanation of explaining what each leg is of the stool, how it's applied, and what it means, and then you did a really great job with that. It was really interesting to the reader. So I just thought that whole approach was completely different than what we're doing in America and what we did in America. So definitely keep that. Those are really strong paragraphs, and I enjoyed reading those. I would also just maybe try to further explain why they try to deter the feminism theory in the EU as opposed to in America, because we put a lot of emphasis on the feminism theory here, but not in the EU from what I got from your paper. So maybe further explain why they try to deter from that and why that's not their approach to gender equality. Your last paragraph, when you start to discuss the commission, can kind of gets a little confusing. I found myself rereading it just a couple of times because I wasn't really following it step by step. Maybe you could just try to explain how they're trying to implement those gender equality policies. I think you can just clean it up a little bit, make it more concise for your reader. Other than that, that was a great paragraph. The 6th section is about U.S. gender policies and their differences and effects on the EU. So I really, before I even read this paragraph, I enjoyed that you put this in there and contrasted America's gender policies and the EU's, because obviously throughout this whole time I've been discussing how America's completely different take and approach on the feminism theory and gender policy. So I think this paragraph is already super strong and a good addition to your paper. Your first paragraph made me laugh just because of how different the approaches are in both countries. Your second paragraph had a few minor spelling and grammar errors, but those are also easily fixable. I would note in your last paragraph if the U.S. has anything like the EU's positive action programs, because I thought that was super interesting. And I think people would want to know if we have anything like that here, or if that's strictly over in the EU, and why don't we have something like that if we don't. Both the EU and the US have made it clear there is gender equality issues, but they try to emphasize how much more the EU, but you should try to emphasize how much more the EU has done to combat their gender equality issues as in comparison to us here in America. Um, all in all, your conclusion was really good. It like wraps everything all together, which it should. Your last sentence shouldn't state what the EU will do though in the future, because there's no way you can actually like know that for sure. So maybe just change your last paragraph or your last sentence a little bit, and don't really state what exactly the EU is going to do in the future. All in all, you had really strong research. I think you found some really good sources, and you did a great job citing them. So that was all really great. I mean, I really enjoyed reading this paper. I think you picked an awesome topic. And yeah, so good luck on your final draft. Thanks.